In the dead of night, when silence reigns supreme and shadows stretch endlessly, imagine hearing a knock at your door, a knock that refuses to stop. Don't forget to subscribe Midnight Scary Tale and press the bell icon. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of the night of endless knocks. Sit tight, because this story will leave you questioning every sound you hear in the dark. In a quaint little town surrounded by dense, eerie woods, stood a solitary house at the edge of the village. It belonged to a young woman named Clara, who had recently moved there to escape the chaos of city life. The townsfolk had warned her about the midnight curse of the house, but she laughed it off as a small-town superstition. It was a cold, moonless night. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters of Clara's house. She sat by the fireplace, sipping tea and reading a book. As the clock struck midnight, a sudden, sharp knock echoed through the house. Startled, Clara looked up. Who could it be at this hour? She wondered aloud. She approached the door cautiously and peeked through the peephole, but there was no one there. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as a prank and returned to her chair. But just as she sat down, the knocking resumed, louder and more persistent this time. Clara's heart raced. She grabbed her phone and called the local police. "Someone's knocking at my door, but I can't see anyone. Can you send someone over?" she pleaded. The officer on the other end sighed. "It's probably just the wind, ma'am, but we'll send someone to check on you." As she waited, the knocks grew more erratic, like fists pounding desperately against the wood. Suddenly, they stopped. A chilling silence fell over the house. Clara sighed in relief, thinking it was over. But then, from the window behind her came a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap. She spun around, clutching a fireplace poker, and slowly approached the window. Again, no one was there. Just the vast expanse of darkness and the swaying trees. Minutes turned to hours, and the knocking continued, shifting from the door to the windows, then to the walls. It was as if something was circling her house, trying to get in. Desperate for help, Clara called her neighbor, Mr. Benson, who lived a mile away. "Clara, listen to me carefully," he said in a grave tone. "Whatever you do, do not open that door, and for God's sake, don't respond to the knocks." "Why? What's going on?" Clara demanded. "Years ago," Mr. Benson began, "a family lived in that house. One night, they heard the same knocks. When they opened the door, they vanished, without a trace. The only clue left behind was the word 'welcome' scrawled in blood on the wall." Clara's blood ran cold. As Benson continued explaining the house's dark history, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if the entity knew she was learning its secret. And then, without warning, it stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Clara barely had time to breathe a sigh of relief when the lights in the house flickered and went out. In the pitch blackness, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from her own number. The message read, "Let me in." Clara's breath hitched as the knocks resumed, louder and more frantic than ever. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, "I'm already inside." She froze, gripping the poker tightly, her eyes darting around the dark room. She could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. But Clara lived alone. Clara's trembling fingers tightened around the fireplace poker. Her eyes darted toward the staircase, cloaked in darkness. Every creak of the floorboards above sent a jolt of terror through her body. Who or what was up there? The footsteps paused at the top of the stairs, as if whoever or whatever was standing there was deciding its next move. Clara's heart thundered in her chest as she took cautious steps backward, her phone clutched in her other hand. She quickly texted her neighbor, Mr. Benson, "Please come now. Someone is inside my house." Her phone buzzed almost instantly with a reply. "Get out of the house. Now." Clara's eyes darted toward the front door, but the thought of stepping out into the freezing darkness, where the knocking had first started, felt equally terrifying. Before she could decide, the footsteps resumed, this time descending the stairs. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Clara's breath caught in her throat as a low, guttural whisper echoed through the house. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was menacing, inhuman. Fighting the urge to scream, she bolted toward the kitchen and locked the door behind her. She pressed her back against it, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The whispering grew louder, as if it were just on the other side of the door. Suddenly, the knocks resumed, this time from every direction. The walls, the windows, even the ceiling. The relentless pounding filled the house, a maddening cacophony that drowned out Clara's frantic thoughts. And then, as abruptly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was suffocating. Clara strained her ears, listening for any sound. That's when she noticed it, the faint sound of breathing. Not hers, but something else. Something in the kitchen with her. She whipped around, her eyes scanning the darkness. A shadow shifted in the corner, and 2 glowing red eyes stared back at her. Clara screamed, swinging the poker wildly. The shadow moved with impossible speed, darting out of sight. The kitchen door rattled violently as if something was trying to break in. Desperate, Clara ran toward the back door, flung it open, and stumbled into the icy night. The cold bit into her skin as she sprinted toward the woods, her breath coming out in frantic gasps. She glanced back at the house, hoping to see lights from Mr. Benson's truck pulling up, but instead, she saw her own shadowy silhouette standing in the window. It waved at her. Clara's legs gave out, and she fell to her knees in the snow. Her phone buzzed again. She hesitated before looking at the screen. Running won't help. The message was accompanied by a photo of her, kneeling in the snow, taken from just behind her. Clara spun around, but there was nothing there except endless rows of dark trees. She scrambled to her feet and ran deeper into the woods, the icy branches clawing at her skin. The knocking started again, but this time it was coming from the trees around her. The sound followed her, growing louder and closer, until it seemed like the entire forest was alive with the relentless pounding. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. She answered it with shaking hands, too terrified to think straight. "Hello?" she whispered. A distorted voice crackled on the other end. "You can't escape me." Clara dropped the phone and kept running until she burst into a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and lifeless. Desperate for shelter, she ran inside and slammed the door shut. The cabin smelled of mildew and decay, but it was quiet. Too quiet. Clara pressed her ear against the door, listening for any signs of pursuit. All she could hear was the sound of her own ragged breathing. As she turned to explore the cabin, she noticed a series of markings carved into the walls, symbols and words she didn't recognize. In the center of the floor was a trap door, its edges worn and splintered. A faint sound drifted up from beneath it, knocking. Clara stepped back, her pulse racing. The knocking grew louder, more urgent. Suddenly, the trapdoor burst open and a hand, pale, clawed, and impossibly long, reached out. Clara screamed as the hand grabbed her ankle and pulled her toward the opening. She fought back, swinging the poker and kicking wildly, but the grip was too strong. Just as she was about to be dragged into the darkness, the cabin door flew open, and Mr. Benson appeared, shotgun in hand. "Get away from her!" he shouted, firing at the hand. The creature released Clara with an ear-piercing shriek, retreating into the darkness below. Mr. Benson grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. "We need to go. Now," he said, his voice shaking. As they ran out of the cabin, the knocking started again, louder and more frenzied than ever. The entire structure shook violently as they sprinted back toward the village. When they finally reached Benson's house, Clara collapsed onto the couch, trembling. "What was that thing?" she whispered. Benson's face was pale. "I don't know, but whatever it was, it's not done with you." Clara sat in Benson's living room, her knees drawn up to her chest. The shotgun he had used to scare off the shadowy figure now rested on the coffee table, loaded and ready. Despite the warmth of the fireplace, a bone-deep chill had settled over the room. "Mr. Benson," Clara began hesitantly, "do you know what's going on? What's out there?" Benson sighed deeply, his gaze fixed on the window. "I don't know what it is exactly," he admitted, "but I've heard stories. That cabin, it's older than anyone remembers. People say it's tied to something dark, something that feeds off fear." Clara shivered. "What does it want from me?" Benson hesitated. "I don't think it's just you. The cabin calls to people. Once it chooses someone, it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." Before Clara could respond, a loud bang echoed through the house. Both of them jumped. The knocking was back. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and menacing, came from the front door. Benson grabbed the shotgun and motioned for Clara to stay put. He edged toward the door, his movements slow and deliberate. Clara's heart raced as she watched him peek through the peephole. "Nothing," he muttered. Another knock, this time from the back door. Benson spun around, his face pale. "It's playing with us." The house fell silent again, but Clara knew better than to feel relieved. Her phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with another message. She hesitated, then picked it up. "Come back, Clara, or it will come for him." Her stomach dropped. "Mr. Benson," she whispered, holding up the phone. He read the text and cursed under his breath. "It's trying to lure you back." Clara shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "I'm not going back to that cabin. I can't." "You might not have a choice," Benson said grimly. "If you don't go, it'll come here, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants." Suddenly, the knocks returned, louder and more chaotic. This time, they came from all sides of the house, windows, walls, and doors. The sound was deafening, a relentless cacophony that made Clara cover her ears. "We need to leave," she screamed over the noise. But as soon as she spoke, the lights flickered and went out. The house was plunged into darkness. The escape Benson grabbed a flashlight and handed Clara a small handgun. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. Clara nodded, her hands trembling. "Stay close," he said. They moved toward the back door, Benson leading the way with the shotgun. The knocking followed them, moving from one side of the house to the other, as if whatever was outside could sense their every move. When Benson opened the back door, the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it an eerie silence. The knocks had stopped. "Run," he whispered. They bolted toward Benson's truck parked at the edge of the driveway. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see a figure chasing them. But the woods remained still, the trees casting long, menacing shadows under the pale moonlight. Benson fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he tried to unlock the truck. Just as he got the door open, a piercing scream erupted from the woods. It was unlike anything Clara had ever heard, inhuman and filled with rage. "Hurry!" she yelled, climbing into the passenger seat. Benson started the engine, and they sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and whatever haunted it behind. The final revelation ours. Later, they arrived at the nearest town. Exhausted and shaken, Clara and Benson checked into a motel. Benson made sure the door was locked and barricaded before they sat down to catch their breath. "We're safe here," Benson said, though his voice lacked conviction. Clara wasn't so sure. Her phone buzzed again, and dread pooled in her stomach as she looked at the screen. "You can't run from me, Clara." She dropped the phone, her hands trembling. "It's not over, is it?" Benson shook his head. "Number? And it won't be until you face it?" Clara stared at him, her mind racing. She didn't know what facing it meant, but one thing was clear. Running wasn't an option anymore. Outro, dear viewers, thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into the night of endless knocks. Will Clara find the courage to confront the entity, or will it continue to torment her, pulling her deeper into its dark game? If you enjoyed this story and want to know what happens next, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Midnight Scary Tales. Do you have a real-life horror story or a tale you'd like to share? We'd love to hear it. Send your story to us at a K3-717507@gmail.com, and you might just see it featured here. Until next time, remember, when the knocking starts, don't open the door.